you write for the screen as well, and you can somehow with screen on you get the audience, what is that, whatever it is, the feedback instantly. And than through literature, the screen feedback is more prominent. And since you juggle between fiction and screenwriting, and what do you think works more? What kind of climate stories work more in your opinion? And one is what you're drawn to, like speculative fiction, like hardcore speculative fiction, dystopian, showing a dystopian world, or stories of hope. Uh, what are you drawn to, and what do you think audience expect of stories, to storytellers in general?
Um, Personally, I think I'm naturally drawn to a little more speculative stuff, but I don't think in any way that means that I believe that is the best vehicle to tell climate change stories. It just happens to be what I'm drawn to in general. Um, but I do think that we do need both kind of stories. Like we do need hopeful stories, and we do need the dystopian ones, because I think having hope is kind of like a recognition that something is wrong, right? Like you have hope for change because you've realized that something needs change. And quite often I think recognizing something is wrong requires anger and a recognition that things are not uh, things aren't really going the way we want them to go right now. And so I think these things do need to work in tandem, or and as writers, as whatever form of writing you're doing, what we have to respond to instead is, where are we as a society right now? Are we how bad is it, and are we doing enough? And if we're not doing enough, does that mean we have to get people angry before we get them hopeful? And so that becomes what you can choose to do. I think any writer can choose to do how they please, like what they think is going to. But again, I agree largely with what Alina was saying earlier, which is that I also don't think it is the role of the fiction writer to spur the people on. So when I'm writing a story, the idea isn't that I want to tell people what to think, or it's more I am sort of dealing with my own confusion. I don't have the answers to anything. I'm not a scientist. I'm not. I'm simply a person who is writing, and I want to be a reflection of that, which I think a lot of people are. Whether it is anxiety or anger or whatever it is, right? Like in this story, for example, it is more anger and anxiety because that is what I feel, and it doesn't necessarily resolve itself in a neat way either. But that's because I don't have it resolved in my head either. And I feel like being able to reflect that and show that, okay, if you feel the same way, you're not the only person feeling that way. And if that brings about certain sort of rage and awareness, that's great. uh, and as I said, the only way you can actually be hopeful of something is when you recognize something is bad, and recognition does require an amount of rage. It does require some amount of being pissed off with what's happening. And yeah, and I think I don't think it's fair to sort of for us to be like, okay, we need to have hopeful stories and we need to have despair, like dystopian stories. I think that we do need both of them because they're both serving a certain purpose, as long as the writers of these stories are also honest about how they feel, because there are hopeful writers and there are less hopeful writers, but both of them should be telling their stories because both of them want the same thing, that things are okay. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Prithvir. And I think the solution does that beautifully, a tongue-in-cheek narrative, and it makes you think, and it does that beautifully. And Prashant, I'll move to you. Hotel World, the title of your story, is very intriguing, and I was waiting to dig in what comes beneath the title. So there's AI. You use AI as a destructive force there, and you portray AI as a destructive force. And what happens later is not really melodramatic, and there's a kind of subtle realism to it. So how you showed it, and can you give us a little thoughts on what went into this world building?
Sure. Just on the title first, I mean, the hotel wall, it's based. So in Goa, in India, I live very near the Grand Hyatt Hotel, and it is famously building a huge seawall, which is sort of encroaching upon the public beach. And it's really very much you're inside the wall, and within the hotel compound, and you've got this beautiful lawn, and then the people outside this wall, which is literally just encroaching and pushing us into the sea. It's it's really a metaphor for how this kind of rich, privileged people within this gated community are kind of continuing to enjoy the fruits of this dwindling resource of the water available on the island. So that was the kind of thinking behind the title of the hotel wall, and it's very much real. And my wife is quite actively campaigning against the hotel's encroachment like this. On the world building, I mean, the story itself is set a few 5 years after some great calamity, which is where the AIs have a short duration war against humanity and essentially bring down civilization. It's very much in the backdrop of the story, and I was quite attracted to the way that Lord of the Flies, that William Golding book, it never really talks about why those kids were on the island. They were on an island, but we just know that there has been something that's happened, and they found themselves essentially going feral because some calamities occurred outside. And I think the book ends with the British Navy rocking up to the island and rescuing them. So I wanted that kind of atmosphere of a tragedy occurred somewhere outside. In most of my fiction, I have this sort of unified universe in which there is this kind of AI war. In fact, my book, The Rising Tide, that's more centrally talks about the war between the AIs and humanity that occurs in the mid 2040s. What it's really trying to say is that climate change is one of those. I mean, I've been working professionally now for 35 years on climate change issues. When I first started in 1990, it was a very low impact. Nobody really knew what was going on. It was really not until 1992 with the Rio conference that it became, the source of the convention and all this kind of thing. So it's been a chronic problem for, my professional career of 35 years. But what has happened in the intervening year has been these kind of acute issues like the financial crisis of 2007-8, where suddenly all the banking rules were changed, and suddenly it became very difficult for rich countries to lend to poor countries because banking regulations under the Basel Convention toughened up. Last decade we had COVID, which suddenly acutely introduced restrictions on travel, restrictions on flying, and policymakers are suddenly centered around those kind of issues. So I think AI is going to be the problem over the next few decades, and this is the kind of acute problem that AI could go to war, which is where this kind of world building is taking place, or it could be the kind of chronic issue of worklessness. I mean, I think in India something like 80% of engineers now don't get work from when they're qualified because of this reduction in demand for newly minted civil engineers, electrical engineers, those kind of things. So I wanted to tackle the acute AI problem. And I mean, again, a bit of a spoiler alert. In my books, I talk about rich billionaires, sort of who are intent on living forever. They effectively are using AI to train, so machine learn their own lives. So the training data set for these people is their own experiences, what books they've read, all the emails they've sent, everything that everybody they've ever spoken to. So instead of the AI being trained on everything, it's being trained on just one human being, one personality, and it's a way of people replicating themselves. But if you think about what that will do, it'll give immense power to people, or these AIs, and but also the foibles of those people. So imagine an Elon Musk suddenly living forever and being the kind of the heart and soul of an AI. So imagine that kind of world. So that's the kind of backdrop. But in this particular short story, I didn't really develop it. I've written other stories where those kind of ideas are developed more. But I mean, the general message is climate change is going to be a really, really big problem over the next coming decades. But policymakers will continue to be have their attention drawn to other things. So at the moment, we're going through a right-wing phase with reform in the UK, BJP, and whatever it gets up to in India, and similar kind of things in many other countries. And I think that will dominate economic politics for the next 5, 10 years, rather than climate change, sadly.